All Swedes should mentally prepare for war. That was the message Micael Bydén, the Supreme Commander of the Swedish Armed Forces, sent loud and clear on Swedish international broadcaster TV4 in January 2024. This message, or should we say warning, was just one of the ominous statements made by Bydén. Another one, previously made on the same platform, hints at why Sweden is preparing for war. Russia's war against Ukraine is just a step, not an endgame, Bydén warned. As you can imagine, these nationally broadcast proclamations have plunged the nation into a state of anxious anticipation. This is best seen in a 3,500% increase in visits to the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency's web-based bomb shelter map and a 900% rise in downloads of the agency's information booklet titled "If Crisis or War Comes." However, these proclamations also made us pose the question, will a war in Scandinavia come? After all, with the largest population and the highest gross domestic product (GDP) by a margin, Sweden is often considered the most powerful and influential among the Scandinavian countries. So if Sweden is seemingly gearing up for a war against Russia, will all Scandinavian countries follow in its footsteps? That's what this video will look into. It will also dissect how ready Scandinavian nations are for war. After all, a heightened mental state of readiness means nothing if the physical and logistical aspects of preparedness are lacking. But before we go any further, we must define the Scandinavian nations we'll be discussing. Why? Because people often confuse the term Scandinavia with the broader concept of the Nordic countries. A sub-region of Northern Europe, Scandinavia primarily refers to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. However, though not geographically part of Scandinavia, Finland is often listed as a Scandinavian country due to its cultural and historical ties to the region. The country's ties to Sweden in all matters, civil and military, are what makes Finland particularly relevant for this video. So as far as we're concerned, Finland is part of Scandinavia. This also makes it a part of countries potentially preparing for war against Russia. But why? Now, don't get us wrong, it's not like Russia and Scandinavia have had this beautiful allyship and friendship throughout history. Even calling these nations friendly might be a stretch. However, there haven't been any explicit mentions of wars between these countries in recent history. So what changed? The answer is simple. Russia invaded Ukraine. With most Scandinavian countries being relatively close to Russia, Finland even shares an 832-mile-long border with the country, they basically have a front-row seat to the atrocities unfolding in the region. But Scandinavian countries aren't looking the other way. On the contrary, they're laser-focused on what's happening to Ukraine and what could happen to them. Just days after his bone-chilling warning on national television, General Bydén shocked Swedes once again, this time at the Folk och Försvar annual national conference, the foremost meeting place for the Swedish security and defense policy community. General Bydén showed a series of gruesome photos from the front lines of the Russo-Ukrainian war, with snowy fields as a backdrop. As these haunting photos alternated, he asked a single question: do you think this could be Sweden? From this question alone, it's easy to conclude that Scandinavian countries are being confronted with the stark possibility of a conflict hitting close to home. In other words, they are preparing for war, as they believe a war is coming their way. A similar sentiment was echoed by Sweden's Prime Minister, Ulf Kristersson, at the same conference. His exact words were, "Our destiny is playing out in Ukraine. The struggle to remain who we are and dare to believe in ourselves. Ukraine is facing an existential threat. This is a threat that we share." However, this threat has certainly achieved one thing. It aligned all the Scandinavian countries on security. That's why Sweden and Finland joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, after years of self-imposed neutrality. This can also be considered a reason as to why Scandinavia is preparing for war against Russia. It now has a united front in the face of a perceived national threat. Though Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO is crucial for the war in Ukraine, this war isn't the only reason behind their decision. The situation in the Arctic has also been a driving force. Now, to be fair, the tensions in the high north have been primarily caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, given everything on the table in the Arctic region, it shouldn't be surprising that the Arctic question has now evolved into a distinct and separate geopolitical concern. You see, all 4 Scandinavian countries are among the 8 Arctic nations. In other words, they have territories in the Arctic region. But do you know which country is also an Arctic nation? That's right, Russia. With Sweden and Finland joining NATO, the remaining 7 Arctic nations, the so-called Arctic 7, are now geopolitically aligned. Therefore, they outnumber Russia 7-1. Given the mighty military most prominent Arctic nations boast, it only makes sense for the Scandinavian countries to up their game and be ready for a potential conflict. But how truly ready are these countries for war with Russia? A quick comparison between Russia's and Scandinavia's military capabilities should answer this question. Spoiler alert, even when combined, Scandinavian countries don't even come close to Russia in most aspects. Take the country's military budgets as an example. Sweden spends the most on defense among the Scandinavian nations, which is about $7.6 billion, or 1.3% of its GDP. Norway is next with $7.3 billion, which is 2% of the country's GDP. Finally, we have Denmark with $4 billion and Finland with a $3.3 billion military budget. Russia alone spends $65.9 billion on defense. And that's not all. The Russian government intends to spend as much as $160 billion on defense, which would surpass 10% of its GDP. To say that this figure dwarfs the combined military budgets of all Scandinavian countries might be the understatement of the century. Unfortunately, similar discrepancies can be seen in virtually all other military areas. For instance, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Denmark have less than 100,000 active military personnel combined. Russia alone boasts roughly 1 million. However, things do look up a little in the reserve military department, as the Finnish defense forces maintain a sizable reserve force of about 900,000 personnel. Add the 31,300 from Sweden, 63,000 from Denmark, and 40,000 from Norway, and Scandinavia can at least muster over half of Russia's 2 million reservists. Regrettably, the same can't be said for any of the military equipment in these countries' army, navy, and air force. Let's do a quick overview to help you understand just how huge the difference between these potential war players is in this department. Since Russia shares quite a lengthy border with one of the Scandinavian nations, let's tackle the land forces first. First up, tanks. Russia boasts over 12,000 tanks, while the Scandinavian nations have under 500 together. With 200, Russia's neighbor Finland has less than half this number. Scandinavia has slightly better odds in the armored fighting vehicles department, as Denmark has over 4,000, Sweden and Finland over 2,000 each, and Norway over 550. But then again, Russia has over 24,000 of these vehicles on its own. As for the artillery, we're back to abysmal figures. Russia's total artillery strength is approximately 18,266, a far cry from Scandinavian assets, which at best go over 800 in Finland. Now you might think these numbers aren't really relevant, as a vast majority of Russian land forces are deployed in Ukraine, and that's absolutely right. However, its air and sea forces remain intact. So let's take flight for a second, though you'll probably want to land again as the situation in the sky is even more lopsided. Russia boasts an impressive fleet of almost 4,500 aircraft. This figure includes 1,665 helicopters, 689 attack aircraft, 340 fighter aircraft, 384 multi-role aircraft, and 100 unmanned combat vehicles, UCAVs. As for Scandinavia, the total number of aircraft between all 4 countries is just under 600. The breakdown is even more dreary, as the Scandinavian countries don't possess the same aircraft capabilities. However, these countries are well aware of this fact. That's why in March 2023, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Denmark moved to create a unified Nordic air defense and significantly strengthen its numbers. To this end, Norway ordered 15 more F-35 fighter jets to add to its existing 37 ones. Finland has 64 F-35s on order and 62 FA-18 Hornet jets in store, and Denmark will add 27 F-35s to its fleet of 58 F-16 fighter aircraft. So the situation in the sky seems somewhat optimistic, but what about the sea? If we take our hypothetical battle to the sea, Scandinavia might stand a chance, as its total number of naval assets is almost 500 compared to Russia's 653. However, in areas where numbers truly matter, such as aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines, Russia wields significant superiority. The Scandinavian countries, on the other hand, either have none of these crucial vessels or fall in the single-digit zone. Though these numbers sound bleak, the worst is yet to come. No Scandinavian country possesses a single nuclear weapon. In contrast, Russia has roughly 6,000, placing the country at the forefront of global nuclear capabilities. Of course, we must note that the absence of nuclear weapons in Scandinavia is intentional, reflecting a long-term commitment to being a nuclear weapon-free zone. Still, this doesn't change the fact that Russia is very much a nuclear weapon-armed zone, and a dangerous one at that. With all these facts and figures in mind, one thing becomes abundantly clear: Scandinavia alone could never stand up to Russia. But luckily, Scandinavia isn't alone. The region's alliance with NATO is nothing short of game-changing and is sure to boost Scandinavia's odds in a potential war. Just remember what Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty states. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. Article 5 allows NATO allies to assist the attacked country by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with other NATO allies, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. For now, Article 5 has been invoked only one time, after the September 11th terrorist attacks on the US. However, the mere existence of this article provides solid insurance for member countries. That's why this article can serve as a sufficient explanation of why Sweden and Finland chose to abandon their policies of neutrality after decades and join NATO. Of course, Norway and Denmark have long waited for their Scandinavian neighbors to join them in NATO, as these countries have been a part of the alliance since its very inception. In fact, Norway and Denmark are among the 12 founding member countries of NATO. With this in mind, let's briefly discuss the cooperation between NATO and the Scandinavian countries to understand the importance of all four nations being a part of the alliance. First up, Norway. Norway has been quite an active NATO member since the alliance's formation. It participated in several NATO operations, including the 1999 bombing of Yugoslavia and the 2011 military intervention in Libya. The country also sent troops to Afghanistan following the September 11th attacks. Norway's national delegation to NATO includes high-status personnel from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense. However, when it comes to Russia, Norway has followed a reassurance policy since the Cold War, limiting the presence of NATO past the 28th longitudinal zone, close to the Norwegian-Russian border. Of course, it's highly unlikely this policy will hold under the new geopolitical circumstances. The next in line is Denmark, a country that went from being neutral for decades to becoming a founding member of NATO. How is this possible? Well, it's simple. Following 2 world wars, Denmark stopped viewing neutrality as foolproof security assurance and opted to consider other solutions. The first option emerged between the 2 world wars, and it involved joining all the Scandinavian countries, plus Iceland, in an alliance. After all, these countries shared centuries of history, similar democratic values, and a strong culture of consensus building. Unfortunately, World War II forced them to shelve these plans and ultimately pushed Denmark to NATO. However, the country only joined NATO on 3 conditions. Number 1, NATO won't establish permanent military bases in Denmark, with the exception of Greenland. Number 2, NATO will respect Denmark's commitment to a non-nuclear weapon policy. Number 3, there will be no allied military activity on the entire territory of the Danish kingdom. Interestingly, these conditions also had something to do with Russia, or to be precise, Russia's predecessor, the Soviet Union. With these conditions, Denmark hoped to present its accession to NATO as strictly a defensive measure and not a provocation to the Soviet Union. However, as time went by, Denmark took a more active and confident role in NATO. In the 1950s, the country was involved in NATO's Northern Command, together with Norway. In the 1970s, it became part of the Stanav Forchan, Standing Naval Force Channel, NATO's permanent maritime presence in the English Channel. During this period, Denmark also participated in NATO's Trans-European Radar System, which was designed to provide air defense in a supersonic age. Afterward, Denmark fully embraced its role with the alliance and made NATO the cornerstone of its defense. However, throughout all these years, Denmark's northern neighbors, Sweden and Finland, remained neutral. Though to be fair, Finland was neutral significantly less time than Sweden. The country only adopted this policy during the Cold War era, especially after World War II. Its neutrality also ended sooner, as Finland became a member of NATO on April 4, 2023, almost a year after applying for membership. By the end of 2023, the country signed bilateral military agreements with the US, allowing its personnel and weapons at dozens of Finnish bases, including some in the Arctic. Finland's NATO membership almost doubled the length of the alliance's border with Russia. But what is arguably the most fascinating part of Finland's evolution regarding NATO is the incredible shift in public opinion toward the organization. As recently as December 2021, more than half of Finns opposed joining NATO. In November 2022, 78% of them were in favor. This stunning reversal just goes on to show that the Finnish people see NATO as the only way to protect their country against Russia. If we were to travel west, we'd see that nearly 60% of Swedes shared the same opinion about NATO as of 2022. Though this figure might be considered significantly lower than that of Finland, it's still monumental for a country that was neutral for more than 210 years before joining NATO. That's right, the last time Sweden was involved in a war was in 1814, when it briefly fought a fellow Scandinavian country, Norway. Since then, Sweden has pursued a policy of non-alignment in peacetime and neutrality in wartime, as the Swedish government puts it. Still, throughout the years, Sweden strived to maintain close relationships with NATO members without explicitly joining the organization. However, as Russia brutally invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Sweden realized this wasn't enough. So Sweden applied for NATO membership at the same time as Finland. Of course, Finland was also one of the major driving forces behind this decision, as these two nations have historically worked closely together on virtually all issues. Now you might wonder, if Sweden and Finland applied for NATO membership at the same time, why did Sweden have to wait to become a member nearly 1 year after Finland? Two countries are to be blamed for Sweden's painstaking journey to NATO: Turkey and Hungary. Both countries defended their decision to withhold membership based on the hostile attitude Sweden had displayed toward them in the past. Since Turkey and Hungary have since ceased blocking Sweden's entry to NATO, we won't spend too much time delving into the real reasons for this delay. We'll only leave you with a couple of facts. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has historically maintained quite a close relationship and collaboration with Russia's President Vladimir Putin. At the same time, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who has been in power for 14 years, is often referred to as Putin's mouthpiece by his critics. You can draw your own conclusions. But let's focus on the more positive aspects of this story. Sweden finally became a NATO member on March 7, 2024, and according to many experts, NATO is precisely where Sweden has belonged all along. After all, Sweden connects the Baltic region to the transatlantic link and can play a key role in deploying and transporting Allied combat forces. But will Allied combat forces need to be deployed through Sweden and the rest of Scandinavia? In other words, how likely is it for a fully fledged war to break out between this region and Russia? If we were to look for an answer in the past, it would probably be very likely. After all, Russia and Scandinavia, and for that matter, the newest NATO members, Sweden and Finland, haven't had the best history. Going back to the 17th and 18th centuries, the Russian Empire kept trying to conquer Finland, which was a hinterland of the Swedish Empire at the time. However, the Swedish Empire settled the score by invading and conquering parts of the Russian Empire in the early 18th century under the command of King Charles XII of Sweden. Unfortunately, the victories were short-lived, as Tsar Peter the Great defeated King Charles, marking the end of the Swedish Empire as a major power in Northern Europe. At the beginning of the 19th century, Russia even took Finland from Sweden, turning it into the Grand Duchy of Finland, an autonomous part of the Russian Empire. As mentioned, Sweden embraced a policy of neutrality shortly after, in 1814, but remained a vocal critic of the Russian Empire's subsequent iteration, the Soviet Union. As many Swedes will tell you, Russia has always been perceived as an enemy. The same can be said for Finns, who consider Russia a serious security threat. And how could they not? After all, Finland and Russia fought battles on several occasions, including the Winter War. After World War II, Finland lost roughly 10% of its territory to the Soviet Union, which forced it to relocate 11% of its population, about 400,000 people. The country also had to pay approximately $300 million in war indemnities, which is as much as $5.3 billion at current exchange rates. Though the subsequent period was focused on avoiding any potential conflicts with Moscow, nothing can erase history. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Scandinavian people have had the chance to remember why they dislike Russia, as the country started using a series of grey zone tactics in the region. These tactics refer to sly and unconventional moves made to provoke a nation without crossing the threshold into open armed conflict. For example, in November 2023, Finland had to close its borders to Russia after a massive surge of asylum seekers. Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo labeled this move as instrumentalized immigration in retaliation for joining NATO. Gunilla Herolf, a senior associated research fellow at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, also claimed that Russia has the ability to stop Sweden from functioning through cyber attacks and sabotage operations if it chooses to. But let's go back to the primary question. Will Russia and Scandinavia cross this odd threshold they currently navigate and go into an open-armed conflict? Truthfully, it depends on who you ask. Those who believe that a war is imminent think so because of how unpredictable Putin has become. Plus, Russia's president is seemingly determined to create a new Europe, one where might is right, as Pål Jonson, Sweden's Minister of Defense, puts it. That's why Jonson believes that a Russian attack on Sweden can't be ruled out. However, others believe that Russia won't attack Sweden. But don't be fooled, this doesn't mean that there won't be an attack. It only means that Russia's target will be another Scandinavian country, Finland. This possibility primarily has to do with Finland's long border with Russia, which creates numerous opportunities for border clashes that can escalate in no time. And let's not forget, after Finland was accepted into NATO, Russian officials warned that this country would be the first to suffer in case of any conflict between Russia and NATO. However, those who believe no conflict will erupt in Scandinavia write off these threats as nothing but posturing. They believe that Russia has already lost too much in Ukraine to start another war in Europe. Of course, this war wouldn't be in anyone's best interest, as it could have severe consequences for all parties involved, and let's face it, the entire world. But Scandinavia isn't the only potential war zone when it comes to Russia. The Arctic region has attracted many a troubled gaze for this very reason. In his 2023 speech at the Arctic Circle Assembly, Rob Bauer, the chair of the NATO Military Committee and Lieutenant Admiral in the Royal Netherlands Navy, stated, "We must be prepared for military conflicts arising in the Arctic." Still, many experts believe that a full-blown military conflict in the Arctic won't likely take place or be instigated by Russia. After all, Russia has too much to lose in the far north, thanks to all the military equipment stationed in the Arctic and the country's numerous resource-extracting projects. But then again, we're talking about Putin, a man who never knew when to admit defeat. If backed into a corner by the growing might of NATO, who knows how Russia's unpredictable and unreliable president might react, especially when you consider that any potential for diplomatic dialogue has long ceased to exist in Russia's case. But what do you think? Were the Scandinavian bombshell warnings just that, warnings? Or are we bound to see actual bombs flying around soon? Or do you think that NATO and the Scandinavian alliance will deter Russia from initiating full-scale military operations in the region? Share your opinions in the comment section below. Now go and check out why Finland joining NATO destroys Putin. Or click this other video instead.